this meeting. There it goes. Okay. And my discussant here is Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss. Okay. She's a professor at the School of Public Affairs and School of Education of American University. Okay. She also directs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. That's PERIL. And she's the author of a very good book, Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. So I'm very happy, Cynthia, that you're here to lead this questioning, and let's begin.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to introduce Professor Main, who is a professor in the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs at CUNY. His research interests are in liberal democracy and its challenges, but also in a wide range of other intellectual areas of interest, including homelessness and urban politics and bureaucracy and public administration. His most relevant books to this conversation are the one we're going to talk about today, The Rise of Illiberalism, published in 2022 by Brookings. But he's also the author of The Rise of the Alt-Right, which is a helpful book that I've read and cited by Brookings in 2018. It's going to be an interview style conversation, and I really look forward to this. So I'm just going to make my screen a little bigger here so I can see everyone. We have the chat is open, and you can put questions into the chat. And Thomas, do you want to say anything to begin before I start to interview you? Would you like to say something about the book or why you wrote it?
Well, very briefly, let's see. I wrote the book on the alt-right because I just finished a large research project. I was looking around for something to do, and I kind of became re-aware of these people that I knew about some of them for some years, didn't realize they were called the alt-right. Anyhow, so I wrote a book about the alt-right, and at that point, many people were saying to me, oh, the movement is so small, even to talk about them, even to bring them up is a bad idea. So one of the things I wanted to do was to document the size of the movement, which I did by looking at digital traffic to their internet sites. So I established to my satisfaction that it was a significant movement. But then after Charlottesville, the violence at Charlottesville, the shock everybody had over the violence at Charlottesville in 2017, there was a violent, excuse me, let's just say vigorous response to the alt-right, and many of these alt-right sites were deplatformed. And a lot of people said, oh, that's it, there's nothing, alt-right, it's all over and done with. And I knew that wasn't true. So what I did is I decided to write about not just the alt-right, but all forms of illiberal ideologies or illiberal political philosophies. That is, political philosophies that reject some feature or all features of liberal democracy. So I did that. I looked at a wider range of websites and documented the size of these various movements. And then I also tried to say something about how American democracy could respond to these movements, primarily by making government more effective so that some of the limitations of liberal democracy that illiberals fix on could be addressed. So that's the book. That's the new book, The Rise of the Alt-Right.
Fantastic. So I'd like to start with a question, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And so before we start talking about illiberalism, can you, as a scholar of government and public policy, kind of explain for the group what is liberal democracy? And I think that's a good starting place, because people sometimes think it means being liberal, right, as opposed to being conservative. So tell us what it means.
Okay, so let's see. You're absolutely right. You can't understand what illiberalism is until you define what liberal democracy is. Okay, so well, instead of trying to invent a definition of liberal democracy ourselves, why don't we go back to the source, which is the Declaration of Independence, which is probably the most iconic and widely respected formulation of what a free society, how it should organize itself. And if you go there, you find all people are created equal. You know, it says men, but as I could demonstrate back then, men meant human beings. All people are created equal. That's political equality, right? They have certain rights, right? Human rights. That's another feature of liberal democracy. Government derives its powers from just consent of the governed. That's democracy, okay? We can put in there the rule of law. Government always has to act through the rule of law, okay? People have the right to change governments, even resort to revolution if necessary. And also implicit in the Declaration of Independence is a rhetoric, an ethics of controversy that's all about tolerance. The Declaration talks about responding to our British brethren, of producing facts to prove a point to a candid world. So I would say that's a pretty good definition of liberal democracy. Let's go over it. Political egalitarianism, not necessarily economic or any other sort of egalitarianism. Human rights, electoral democracy, the rule of law, a rational and tolerant rhetoric of controversy, and the right of people to change their governments. And I think that, we can make certain additions and have more discussion about the definition, but I think that's quite serviceable.
Great. That's a really helpful baseline because
yes,
my next question. Yeah.
Let me just make one other point. The liberal, as you questioned, the liberal does not refer to liberalism in the sense of the left wing of the Democratic Party, right? There are two elements to liberal democracy. One is electoral democracy. And what does that mean? That means periodic contested elections before a full adult franchise. Okay, so that's the democracy part of it. But can 51% or 50% plus one of the population do anything at all that it wants to with the minority? No, of course not. The democracy has to be limited in ways that it was not in ancient Greece, in ways that it was not during the French Revolution. So the elements of liberal democracy that are intended to limit democracy, like human rights, like the rule of law, that's the liberal element. So the liberal element of liberal democracy refers not to the left wing of the Democratic Party. It refers to those elements of government which restrain a democracy to a certain extent. And as a result, there's a certain amount of tension in the concept of liberal democracy. It endorses democracy and it also limits democracy.
Very, very helpful. I think just as I wanted to make sure we did that as a starting point because, certainly the way that I grew up and the kind of prior education I had and what I was studying, I entered adulthood without really that full understanding. And I think of what liberal democracy is, which doesn't say much for the school system that I came out of, but we all need to make sure that we're on the same page. And I don't like to make assumptions about what people already understand. So given that, now that we understand what liberal democracy is, what is illiberalism? And can you tell us what that is?
Yes, illiberalism is any political philosophy that rejects in part or in whole those elements of liberal democracy. So, so let's see. Are there people who say, no, all people are not created equal? Oh, yes. There, and by the way, that's maybe the essence of illiberalism. Anybody who steps forward boldly and says, I reject the idea that all people are created equal, that is the essence of illiberalism. And are there people who do that? Absolutely. If you go to, sometimes I hesitate to even mention these sites, but just to demonstrate that they're out there, places like the American Renaissance, which is an alt-right site that says, it's absolute nonsense that all people are created equal. It's a form of insanity to say that all people are created equal. The phrase all people are created equal is one of the most damaging sentences ever written, right? So there are really people who do reject political egalitarianism, right? Are there people who reject democracy? Yes, there are people who reject democracy. Again, you can find at the alt-right at sites like Countercurrents Publishing, say things like, oh, one person, one vote. No, democracy is more like one idiot, one vote. or Zero Hedge says that democracy degrades people's moral values and harms capital accumulation. So there are people who step forward and say, yes, I'm against liberal democracy, I'm against electoral democracy. There are people who reject the idea of human rights. They mostly come from the European New Right. They say that, human rights, this is a tool by which Western elites dominate over the rest of the world. Human rights, there are no such thing as human rights. So illiberalism is the rejection of one or more of these elements of liberal democracy. There really are people who say that. And by the way, let me point out, illiberalism comes in at, two flavors, left-wing and right-wing. So I've been talking mostly about right-wing illiberalism, which includes the alt-right and, of course, neo-Nazism and the KKK and the manosphere and similar expressions. But then on the left, all forms of communism, anarchism, some forms of Marxism reject one element or another of liberal democracy. And so that's the basic conception of illiberalism and its main flavors.
So now that we have an understanding of both liberal democracy and illiberalism, both across the political spectrum, but especially on the right, which you're studying, how big of an issue is it today in the contemporary United States? And looking over time, even, does this wax and wane? Is there always an illiberal fringe? And how would you characterize the current moment in terms of the strength of this?
Well, let's limit ourselves to the America during the post-war period. Okay. Now, so so there were always during that period of time, if you go, but let's go back to like the mid 50s. There were, there were segregationists, which who denied that all people were created equal. There was the John Birch Society. There was even a neo-Nazi movement in the 60s. And it's very hard to know exactly what the size of that movement was. Okay. However, we can judge the size of illiberal movements. And by the way, so I'm assuming one way to try to understand how influential a particular movement or political philosophy is to look at the size of its audience. Okay. So there may be other ways to gauge its strength, but that's the most straightforward. So, and it's easy to find out the size of digital audiences for illiberal websites. And perhaps we can talk at some point as to exactly how I define some websites as being illiberal and others as being conventionally progressive, conventionally conservative. So anyhow, but to give you a flavor, I looked at traffic to 1,952 websites of all sorts of political orientations, going from the illiberal left, so that's like communists and anarchists, all the way through the conventional progressive left, the left center, moderate or centrist groups, center right, the conventional right, and then the illiberal right. So I looked at almost 2,000 sites. And so let's talk about the illiberal right-wing sites. And we can talk again at some point how I identified them. Anyhow, in the first 11 months of 2019, that's the period I had data for, all right-wing illiberal sites had on monthly average about 186 million visits per month. Okay. Now, is that a lot or a little? Right. Well, let's see. It's about 31% the size of the visitorship to conventional conservative sites. And by conventional conservative sites, I mean places like the National Review. That's like the quintessential conservative, conventional conservative site. Conventional conservative site meaning one that's within the bounds of liberal democracy, whatever else you may think of. So the illiberal right is about 31%, almost a third the size of the conventional right. And it's about it's about 19%, 1/5 the size of the conventional left. Hey, that's pretty big. That's pretty big. That is, and my sense, as I say, it's very hard to kind of measure the size of these groups in the pre-digital age. My sense is that, the size of the John Bircher movement or the American Nazi Party in the 60s was quite small, especially quite small as compared with with more mainstream ideologies. So anyhow, I say that seems to me to be a significant movement and an extremely radical movement, okay? And so therefore, and we could talk, perhaps I could give examples of just how radical the movement is. But anyhow, that's my evaluation of the relative force or size of right-wing illiberalism.
Terrific. So I see we already have some questions being populated in the chat. I would just encourage folks to go ahead and put additional questions in. I'm going to ask maybe 1 or 2 more questions and then start to incorporate questions from the audience into our conversation.
Okay.
But I would like to turn, so we've covered, kind of what is liberal democracy, what is illiberalism, how big is the problem here? But the kind of the big question that always looms in my mind is, what do we do about it now? And you have a lot of thoughts about what could be done. And I wonder if you could share some of those.
Right. Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, well, let's see. How well is American government performing? Now, of course, if you ask people on the illiberal right, how is American government performing, you will be told American government is a pile of dung. It is completely expropriating the traditional American population. There is no alternative but to secede. So as compared with that sort of standard, American government is extremely positive force and, provides vital public goods that keep us all alive and functioning. However, if we, apply a more realistic standard, I think we have to say that American government is not being nearly as effective as it might be. I think that some groups, for example, people who once had the kind of jobs that my father had, he worked as an electrician for an aerospace company for 40 years. Jobs like that have dried up, and you do have a lower participation in the workforce amongst white males and others. So in various sorts of ways, the American government is not functioning as effectively as it might. And I think that lack of effectiveness is one thing that encourages the growth of the illiberal right. So first thing, I suggest that we need some constitutional amendments to reduce the fragmentation of American government and make it more effective at producing public goods and at addressing social problems. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that we need a better regulated social and digital media. I think that as things now stand, basically the online media it's practically a state of nature. There's no moderation whatsoever. And in a situation like that, there's a race to the bottom. All sorts of crazy people pile in, and what has happened is that the level of political discourse, which used to be conducted through magazines, magazines had the ability to throw out people like anti-Semites, which is what happened at the National Review. That doesn't happen in the digital environment. The anti-Semites and all the rest of them pile in. We need better moderation of digital media to raise the level of democratic discourse, on social media. And then I also think that the right wing wants to try to convince us that the only thing Americans share, well, actually, they put great stress on the idea that America is fundamentally white. And of course, if you do that, of course, you're not focusing on an identity element that all Americans share, because not all Americans are white. So, however, I think there is empirical work that shows that when you talk to people and ask them, what do you mean by being American? people have a set of ideas about what it means to be American. It means embracing the liberal tradition. It means civic republicanism, the idea that you should be active in your community. It means incorporationism. In other words, hey, we're all different and we all come together. And unfortunately, the id of the American identity is ethno-nationalism, AKA racism. So the point I'm getting at is this. I think that there's a lot positive in the actually existing American identity, and that what intellectuals and activists should try to do is try to communicate to people that the kind of changes that are inevitable demographically and the kind of changes that are positive, that they are all compatible with this deep American identity. We want to try to get everybody on the page towards building, a new America, which is not the complete negation of the old America, but a reform of the old America. We want to try to get as many people on the page and involved in building that reformed America as we possibly can by emphasizing the American identity.
Terrific. So my last question for you before we turn, and I see some more questions coming in that will take us back to this, is sort of a follow-up on that, because I completely agree with you on, on the points you're making about needing to kind of challenge the narrative about threat, like needing to, right? So reformulating a kind of a narrative around what demographic change looks like, for example. But at the moment that we're in, when what we see with just the censorship of books happening in schools, the calls for, the attacks on critical race theory, let's say, the kind of how highly politicized this is. I often get asked the question that I don't have a good answer to. So I'm going to answer, I'm going to ask the same question of you. What do you do in an environment where it's hard to even have these conversations and have them be received equally in the same way across the country, when we're so highly politicized about what kids should learn, whether we should wear masks or not, right? We're in a highly polarized and divisive moment. And so what are are there strategies to work within this environment, or do you just talk to the people who will listen and hope for the best?
Well, I can't say much about the wars over curriculum in schools. I mean, you're at a school of education. I'm not. I really not familiar with that. The debate that concerns me especially is limitations to access to the ballot, right? Because that directly addresses a crucial element of a liberal democracy, which is electoral democracy. So there's that, and then also, even if you pay lip service to electoral democracy, but you refuse to concede elections, that you have obviously lost, or that somebody else has obviously won. And if you lead a mob to try to foil the peaceful transfer of power, you are, for all practical purposes, rejecting electoral democracy. So, and I think that, in communicating with people about voter suppression and limitation to the ballot, I think it's very important to emphasize, that the liberal tradition. When I say the liberal tradition, I'm not talking about the liberal democratic tradition, not the left wing of the Democratic Party, but I think we need to communicate to people, hey, listen, the issue here is not who wins and who loses, but we have a deeper commitment to electoral democracy. And I think that, the empirical evidence is that most people do instinctively have that kind of commitment. So we've got to talk about voter suppression, limiting the ballot, less in terms of who this benefits and who it hurts, and more in terms of how it's consistent with the American preference for the liberal tradition. We've also got to meet the fears people have about the rising power of new minority groups, new ethnic groups. We've got to emphasize that, incorporating such people into American society is something that we've done before and that we're pretty good at, okay? So I think and I think especially you want to avoid styles of argument that say things like, oh, the Constitution is trash. It's really, it's always been, it's never been good for us. Therefore, don't talk to me about the Constitution. You want to try to, I think most Americans have an instinctive respect for the Constitution and for the democratic liberal tradition. I think you've got to appeal to that. And also you have to challenge this whole idea that the white race is about to be consumed by a wave of the darker races. I think that, the question of whether whites will go into a minority depends to a considerable extent on how you define white. Do you define people of mixed race as being non-white or as white, right? So anyhow, I think there are many rhetorical strategies that can be used to try to assuage people's concerns about what will happen if voting rights are more guarded than they are now. And so that's one strategy I would advise.
Okay, terrific. So as promised, I will turn away from my own questions and toward the chat questions, which I'll moderate. Right now, I'm just going to start taking questions in the order in which they have appeared in the chat. But as we get more questions, I may cluster some of them together by theme. So please do send your questions into the chat. Any questions, welcome. Really, there's no silly questions here. I think we can ask anything related to the book and its themes. So the first question up is about this tension between what, as you mentioned, the Declaration of Independence as a core part of liberal democracies. The question reads, is it possible to reconcile the fact that at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, how do you reconcile that its statement of human equality with the fact that race-based slavery was legal in each of the signatory states? Yeah. And so I'll just turn that over to you to respond.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to note, if we're just talking about the meaning of the statement, right? It is important to note that the founding fathers did think, however, in a very extremely abstract sort of way, but they did think that the claim all men are created equal did apply to all races, okay? Thomas Jefferson, who said horribly racist things in his book on the state of Virginia, as is well known, in an early draft of the Declaration, one of the complaints that was lodged against the British Crown is that it had brought people from a distant land into slavery, and that these men, M-E-N, capital M-E-N, were having their rights ripped from them by the British Crown. So the point is this: Jefferson, in the first draft of the Declaration, says that the victims of the African slave trade are men, capital M-E-N. He also wrote all men are created equal, and so the implication there, which Jefferson never denied, is that black slaves are equal. Now, of course, now we run into the brick wall of the reality and brutality of American slavery, right? And so, my sense is that what the founders got right was the bare idea, the concept, all right, which is essentially correct, right? They didn't apply it nearly as well as they might have, right? They didn't apply it nearly as well as they might have. And Jefferson, of course, had terribly racist ideas, was very conflicted about slavery, thought never really took effectual measures to end slavery, wanted to believe that slavery one day would end, but that after that, blacks should be transported back to Africa or the West Indies. So, of course, all of this is absolutely horrific. I think what we can say is that, the concept of human equality, the bare concept, is there in the Declaration and other foundational documents we could talk about, but then the long struggle to make it real has been a continuing theme in American history. And sometimes progress has been zero, and sometimes progress has been quite dramatic. Sometimes we've gone backwards. Okay, so I would say that there is a continuing tension in American history and American society between the idea, the vision, the value of human equality, which is there in the founding documents, but there's a tension between that and reality, and implementing that value, making it real, has absorbed the blood, sweat, and tears of many generations of Americans, and especially many generations of Black and minority Americans. And it's an ongoing struggle.
While we're on the Declaration of Independence itself, I want to ask a follow-up question related to another tension about what's stated in those main principles and what we see in the contemporary context. And that relates to the legitimacy of change and revolution, or
Yes.
Because we're in a moment where we have very real calls for civil war happening in these spaces that I'm sure you've encountered, and little movements and scenes like Boogaloo boys and Boogaloo type scenes that it's a code word for a civil war, or a second civil war, that now are on trial for terrorism, for killing people. In the name of that. So what are the limits on that? And, we also have the Oath Keepers, we have groups that are using the Constitution and saying that they're defending it, but from an unlawful militia perspective. So can you just talk a little bit about how much can we lean into the Constitution or to the Declaration of Independence as documents when they are also being misused by some of these same illiberal forces?
Well, I think misuse is the key here. If you read the relevant portion of the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is essentially plagiarized from Locke, okay, and we could talk about why it was plagiarized from Locke. But anyhow, the important point is, Jefferson says, I'll paraphrase pretty closely. Prudence will, of course, require people to suffer abuses for as long as they can possibly be suffered, and that change should not happen for light and transient reasons. But when a long chain of abuses and usurpations, all obviously leading to absolute despotism, become apparent, then people have the right to rise up and change or abolish the government that is committing these abuses and usurpations. So the standard in the Declaration against which one should measure a call for revolution is very high. A long chain of abuses and usurpations invariably leading to absolute despotism, and after a long period of suffering as much as you can. So therefore, the other day I saw someone on a noted television channel who was talking about evil in the modern world, and it's time to say that our adversaries are evil. And so what was the example of evil adversaries that was brought forward? Eric Adams wants to retain mask mandates for young children. Ladies and gentlemen, mask mandates. Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have suggested that you rebel against somebody who wants to impose mask mandates. Okay, mask mandates are not an abuse trending towards absolute despotism. And so these, the complaints of the Oath Keepers and people who call for secession, and there are people who call for secession to create an ethno-state on the American continent, which would undoubtedly result in a pool of blood. And why? Because Hillary Clinton, you see the famous essay about the Flight 96 election, which essentially said, if Hillary Clinton becomes elected, the whole American enterprise is going to crash and burn. These are, the standard of proof against which one has to measure a call to revolution in the Declaration of Independence is very, very high, and none of these ridiculous, hyperbolic, calls for revolution today come within a country light year of meeting that standard.
Thanks, very helpful. I have a two-part question about social media, but also mainstream media or general media. So who do you talked about moderation as an intervention strategy here, but who do you think should be moderating social or general media? And the second part of that is, how can we deal with elements of the mainstream media that give voice to illiberal elements?
Yes. Well, you know, I have to say, let's see. I do think we need better moderation of digital media. Right? Now, however, you know, I'm not an expert on communications law. I'm not an expert on communications technology. So it's difficult for me to give detailed answers here. But I would say that in general, okay, private digital media and outlets, okay, should be regarded as more like magazines, you know, digital magazines, big magazines. They should be regarded more like privately owned but regulated magazines, and less like public spaces to which everybody has access. Okay, and the idea here is to try to replicate on a grand scale and on digital media the sort of gatekeeping that happened at, you know, that was done very inconsistently, you know, and imperfectly, but an attempt was made at it in the National Review, where the John Birch Society and neo-Nazis and anti-Semites and the Ayn Randians were kicked out. So by this vision, the people who would do the moderation would be the owners of these private media. Now, what guarantee is there that these owners will, in fact, engage in sensible moderation? What guarantee is there that they will, in fact, take down malicious material? Well, I think we do need some change in the laws. I think probably the famous or infamous Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act needs to be amended. And digital platforms should have the right, and it should also be considered a duty to take down libel and slander and all the rest of it. Now, you know, we're going to have to, let's see, I'm not in favor of allowing the owners of the digital media to have a completely free hand. There has to be a better regulatory environment, which will require digital owners of digital media to notify people when they are taken down for whatever reason, and give reasons for the exclusion of people from digital media. And then I also think, you know, the most important thing is that public pressure, right? I think the public has basically got its head screwed on, right? And when I note with approval that when public pressure was applied to Twitter over a long period of time, the main source of illiberal disinformation in American politics, that is to say, Donald Trump, ended up being banned from Twitter permanently. That's good. We want to see that sort of thing happen, you know, a lot more frequently, and we need to change communications law and regulations so as to facilitate that sort of responsible behavior by owners and managers of digital media.
Okay, terrific. There are follow-up questions that I have in my head, but I want to make sure to prioritize the other questions in the chat. So we're going to just move right to another topic here, and just reminding everyone to continue to populate. We have about 15 minutes left, so we can continue to ask additional questions. This is a question about efforts to restrict access to voting. So the question reads, would you say that recent state level reforms, it's in quotation marks,
yeah,
to voting rights and access to restrict, so reforms that would restrict access to voting and the embedding of these efforts within one of our two major political parties, is that a visible manifestation of the mainstreaming of illiberalism?
Yes, briefly put, yes. You know, let's see, as I discuss in the book, there's kind of a food chain of ideas. Let's apply that to illiberalism. There's the hardcore. I guess the hardest of the hardcore are places like the Daily Stormers, the most notorious. These are people who boldly step forward and say, no, Black people are not equal to whites. I'm against democracy. I'm against the rule of law. Always blame the Jews for everything. So that's the hardcore of illiberalism. And what happens is, and this is a process that happens with more positive ideas too, these ideas slowly trickle down through a food chain and become softened so as to be palatable by larger audiences. And also these ideas can sometimes be communicated just through a rhetorical strategy. A rhetorical strategy that, instead of trying to convince people, sets out to alienate people and to create a them versus us sort of political environment. So these ideas in softened versions and in terms of rhetoric eventually trickle down and they get absorbed by the Republican Party. I wouldn't call the Republican Party as a whole illiberal, but it is, elements of the Republican Party are embracing illiberal ideas. And I do say that these various plans to limit access to the ballot and to limit reforms, which have turned out to be perfectly serviceable, like mail-in ballots, the desire to end these successful experiments with greater access to the ballot. Why is this happening? These efforts, picked up steam after Trump won, after Trump lost the 2020 election. So the modern wave of so-called voter reforms are in fact motivated by the desire to, stop people who want to vote Democratic, and that's a form of illiberalism. And so, yes, I do see these so-called reforms that are being embraced by a lot of the Republican Party. I do see that as a kind of illiberalism light, which has successfully penetrated the Republican Party.
Perfect. We have, I think, enough time for at least the two questions that are still in the chat. So the next one in order, you mentioned in the beginning that egalitarianism in that original set of principles of liberal democracy is about political egalitarianism, yes. Right? Yes. So this question says, does the financial inequality of capitalism make capitalism inconsistent with liberal democracy? And so what are these other forms of inequality, including financial inequality? Okay,
that's a good question. By the way, there was a time, especially after the collapse of communism, where people argued that democracy requires capitalism, right? That was a serious argument, still is a serious argument. I don't include capitalism as one of the necessary features of liberal democracy. So that's the first thing I would say. Now, second thing I would say is that, it's true that you can have a liberal democracy with varying levels of economic inequality. So the United States is really, there's a high level of economic inequality, higher than was the case back in the 50s and the 60s. And yet I would say, I regard that trend towards greater economic inequality as negative. We got to do something about it. But the point is that it's possible to have liberal democratic institutions endure even in nations where you have a fairly high level of economic inequality. India would be another such example. Now, but hold on for a second. So what connection, if any, does rising economic inequality in the United States have to do with liberal democracy? Well, what I would say is this. One of the reasons you see the growth of illiberalism is, as I say, American government is not functioning as effectively as it might be, and there are many people who are being harmed by necessary capitalist creative destruction, right? So we need more effective distribution to help those people who are not doing as well as they used to be and therefore become susceptible to the illiberal temptation. Now, it used to be said against redistribution that, oh, you know what, wait a second, no, wise up. Even if we completely expropriated the rich and then distributed their money evenly to everybody, all that would happen is everybody would get chump change and we would have destroyed an elite. And by the way, it's not necessarily bad to have an economic elite. You know, they have a stake in the system. They're the people who say, wait a second, the status quo is not so bad. So that used to be the argument against redistribution, okay? That argument doesn't hold anymore. Because why? Because we've got the level of inequality we've got now means that the money up at the top, you know, and of course, nobody is talking about complete expropriation, but even just, you know, relatively modest redistribution would in fact generate quite a bit of money that could be used to improve our delivery of public goods, address various sorts of social problems. And in doing that, and getting that success under our belt, that would improve the faith people have in the system, in liberal democratic government, and that would be positive. So economic redistribution along the lines that I've described can go hand in hand with the defense of liberal democracy.
Okay, thank you. So moving right along, we still have two questions. Every time I think we've gotten through one, there's another one popping up, which is terrific, but we have 10 minutes left. I think we can get to them both. So this is a question, you talked in the beginning of your remarks about illiberalism existing across the spectrum. There's liberalism on the left, there's liberalism on the right, and your book focuses primarily on the illiberalism from the right. So this question, I think, is about your remarks, but it might be more broadly about society. So it just reads it as, why is the leftist illiberalism on campuses not being addressed? Why is it so one-sided? So again, I'm not sure if this person means one-sided in the general discourse or in your research.
Yeah, I can talk about it. Okay. When I talk about illiberalism, I mean a political philosophy that is radically opposed to liberal democracy. Now, there's another way of talking about illiberalism, all right? Illiberalism is sometimes used to mean when you know, it's mostly a charge that's directed at people on the left, and it is alleged that people on the left are censorious, or vindictive, or dismiss ideas that emanate from the right, and that this kind of intolerance, what we might call kind of extreme political correctness, that's another sort of illiberalism which is dangerous. Okay. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, if we're talking about illiberalism as a political philosophy, as I pointed out, in 2019, illiberal websites had an audience of about 186 visits a month on average. Okay. During that same period of time, left illiberal sites, I mean communist sites, anarchist sites, Maoist sites, Guevarist sites, they're out there, they exist. They also, in different ways, reject liberal democracy. They got about 2.5 million visits on average a month. That is an audience about 0.02% the size of the right-wing illiberal audience. No, excuse me. That's an audience that's about 1.3% the size of the right-wing illiberal audience. And if you compare, right-wing illiberalism is about 30% the size of the audience for the conventional conservatives, left-wing illiberalism is about 0.02% the size of the audience for conventional progressives. So if we're talking about illiberalism as a political ideology, the big concern is right-wing illiberalism, and left-wing illiberalism in this sense is minute and is, you know, too small to be concerned about. Now, what about this phenomenon of progressives being overly political correct with conservatives? Well, I think it's an issue. it should be. It's in my opinion, it's not merely an issue of the salience and importance of the penetration of illiberal anti-democratic ideas into American political philosophy. I have come across some examples of what might be called this kind of politically correct illiberalism. I've seen people who have definitions of white supremacy that is so broad brushed that it includes even people who, I've seen interviews done with people from a particular congressional district. People will say, "Oh, I like it here. The kids are all over, and it's a nice place to raise your kids." And I've seen people argue, "Oh, that's a white supremacist expression because the Klan talks about kids too." So I think that listen, calling people white supremacist, and fascist and so forth is. By the way, there are real white supremacists out there. There are real fascists out there. These are extreme positions. One has to, these are charges that should not be directed lightly against garden variety Republicans or people who say, "Gee whiz, I think we ought to have lower taxes," that kind of thing. I think that this kind of politically correct illiberalism is a problem. It's not the problem I'm writing about, and I don't think it's a problem anywhere near the saliency of the penetration of illiberal ideologies into our political culture.
Okay, thank you. And we are going to make it to our last question. We have just our final question here about the boundaries of, and back to the boundaries of what's illiberal or what's not. So I'll just read the question as it is. Is it illiberal to raise and discuss such matters as the roles in slavery of African tribalism and Muslim slave traders? If no, why are these facts ignored? If yes, how can you discuss slavery without a comprehensive overview of the total history?
Well, of course, in discussions of slavery, I'm all in favor of a comprehensive coverage of all aspects of slavery. I don't know. I'm not an expert in the history of slavery. I don't see how the reality of Muslim slavery, if this is, one wants to be careful not to engage in a kind of a howaboutism. So if we talk about American slavery, which of course, we as Americans, we're very concerned about it. We're still living with the effects of it. It had a tremendous impact on our culture, right? And then if somebody then jumps up and says, "Well, you've been talking about slavery in America, but what about the slavery in Muslim countries?" I say, well, excellent point. Why don't you communicate that to the Muslim countries? And I'll file that away in the back of my mind, but it doesn't really detract from the saliency and the importance of slavery in American history.
Terrific. In our final 3 minutes, there's one last question that popped in that I think we can wrap up, that it's a good way to conclude about polarization itself. So seeing rising polarization as we have over the past several years, this question asks, can polarization itself be considered a failure of liberal democracy?
Well, I'm inclined to say no. I'm concerned about what happens when a substantial part of society begins to embrace illiberal political philosophies and ideologies. Right now, can you have a polarized political environment where all the parties are within the liberal democratic spectrum, which is quite broad, by the way? So one can have, and as a matter of fact, I think at one point we did have in American society a political spectrum where you had people like Ted Kennedy, on the left, and there were some, and there was a socialist party a few steps to the left of Ted Kennedy, and then on the right you had Ronald Reagan, and there were a few people that were a number of steps to the right of Ronald Reagan. So that was a polarized political environment, but it was all within the, all parties involved accepted liberal democracy, right? And what we now have, and what I think is sometimes mistaken for polarization, is one party has been penetrated by anti-democratic ideologies and movements and political philosophies, and has moved, and that's the real problem. That's the real problem. So, you know, and to my mind, polarization in and of itself, there may be aspects of it which are, you know, not optimal, but polarization in and of itself, my sense is not the problem. What the problem is anti-democratic ideologies penetrating into what used to be a healthy political culture and, you know, healthy political parties.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I want to say, as we wrap up here in our last minute, there is in the chat a announcement about the next event in this series that I hope you will join. And also say, you know, I'm struck by the fact that for the first time in my own memory, we're headed into a weekend in which people on this webinar and others across the country will be celebrating Passover, Ramadan, and Easter. And so it's a reminder that even as we talk about all of these illiberal trends and kind of hateful content that we encounter, many of us in our ordinary lives are living in worlds that are embracing a kind of social cohesion and a pluralism that I think we can also celebrate. And I wish everyone a peaceful celebration if you are observing. So I want to thank Professor Main for responding so generously to so many questions, and with apologies to anyone whose questions did not come to the fore here. I know we had a couple in private chat, and just wish you all a wonderful weekend ahead. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks to everybody, and you know, you have a happy season, and you know, thanks for this opportunity once again. Thanks for the good questions.